Howdy, this is James Tanner. I'm back again with another one of the Exploring Genealogy Series. This is number 9 in the series, and it's number 4 in the sub-series of researching in the FamilySearch family tree. For those of you who perhaps have not seen all the other videos in this series, I'll bring you up to date. I began, this whole idea here of this series is to demonstrate researching a particular person or family in the FamilySearch family tree. The particular person I chose turns out to have some serious research issues, sort of by random, but it is a indication of what you might find if you start researching certain ones of your established relatives, ancestors in the FamilySearch family tree. So today we're looking back at Alexander Bragg, who was born in 1689 in Salem, Essex, Massachusetts, has 18 sources. And I would assume that 18 sources would make most people feel comfortable that the information was correct. The problem starts occurring when I examined the children of Alexander Bragg and Elizabeth Luther. They're born in a variety of different towns in Massachusetts, and that's pretty early back in the 1700s, which limits their physical ability to travel, and that began suspecting that the information was not consistently supported. And the ancestor that I descend from, these are my direct line ancestors, great, 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 so forth, grandfathers, grandmothers, is Sarah Bragg. And we'll go back to Sarah Bragg now. This is where we left off in the last episode of this series, and determined that, first of all, we have no records. Although there are 23 sources, none of those records indicate with any accuracy who her parents were. So there's no birth record as such. And the death record is suspect because it shows that she died in Span, Johnson County, Georgia in 1813. And if we were to go quickly over to another section up to Google and put in Span, Georgia, and do it. I've got SPA, so let's go to Span, Georgia. And we've got Span, Georgia, Johnson County. We've got to go back and check here. It's Johnson County, that's true. So let's see what we have here in Johnson County. Major highways, adjacent counties, communities, no place named Span. It also looks here, and we find that Johnson County was established in 1858. That's somewhat in from the seaboard ocean, if you want to call it that, that we have where the edge of Georgia is. And so Span County could not have been the place of death of Sarah Bragg. So it didn't exist in 1813. Wherever it wasn't Johnson County. And so far, looking in the list of names of places, isn't any place named Span. And so that begins to raise even more issues. So who was Sarah Bragg, and was she actually the son of Alexander Bragg? Now, in looking at the previous records, it indicates here immediately that, well, my conclusion was that it was pretty well substantiated that she married somebody named Benjamin Ray. But there was another record that came up almost immediately in the sources, and that record was a marriage record from Massachusetts showing that she married somebody named Benjamin Hall, but that turns out to be a problem with indexing. But if we look at the actual record, what we find is that Sarah Bragg married a Benjamin Ray, which is not surprising since that's the person we have in the family tree listed and the marriage date listed as 1759. But she also, Sarah Bragg, is shown as marrying John Hall, 3rd of Norton, Massachusetts, in 1789. Well, if you go back to the list of children for Sarah Bragg, you see that she had children beginning in 1760, listed down to 1783, and also that Benjamin Zalatus Ray dies in 1787, so it is very possible that she had a second marriage in 1789. The question about that second marriage in 1789 is that it's also registered in Wrentham, Norfolk, Massachusetts. And she dies, according to this, in 1813, a few years later, and down in Georgia. So the question would be, did she marry John Hall? Is this the same Sarah Bragg that marries Benjamin Ray? If we assume that it is, then her name is then Sarah Hall. And does Sarah Hall die down in Georgia, as we've looked at a little bit here? Okay, so that's where we are. We're not sure at this point that Sarah Bragg is the daughter of Alexander Bragg. The reason why that would be raised as a question is because she's listed as the last child, 1737, and basically 1696 for her mother's birth. Doesn't make the mother too old, but all of these Alexander Bragg and Elizabeth they're married in Swansea, and Sarah is born in Attleboro. Not that far away, but it still raises more issues. So we have those issues here. Today, what I think we'll start to do, this would be my normal process of examining and trying to resolve this kind of a problem, is to look at the children. So we first looked through very quickly through the dates to see how those work out. 1760, 61, 64, 66, 69. We have 3 years, 60, that's 72. Another 3 years, 72, 2 and 72, unless they are twins, or one was born very early in the year, like in January, and the other one was born very late in the year, like in December. Probably not even possible. So it's a question, of course. And on these two, one was born in British colonial America, and the other one was born in Wrentham, north of Massachusetts. So another issue is, why is this lady who was born in Wrentham, married in Wrentham, and then remarries in Wrentham? How does she and why does she end up in Georgia? Probably not. That's probably not the case. There's somewhere that record came from. So we have another question. We have sort of a Philette, spelled Philete, Ray, who is doesn't have a birth, but dies in New York. Kind of interesting, especially given the early time periods here. Then we have another one who was born in Wrentham and dies in Vermont. Originally, I thought that the ones who died in Vermont were outliers, that there was no possible way that they could have been people in this family, that there's two families, one in Vermont and one in Massachusetts. But it turns out that in the mid-1700s, there was a major land sales effort and promotion of land sales in Vermont. And a lot of people bought into that Vermont land and moved north from Connecticut and from Rhode Island and from New York and Massachusetts and other places into Vermont. Interestingly enough, when they got there, they found out it wasn't the greatest place in the world to live for farming, and particularly because of the soil and the temperature. And so many of them moved back south to where they came from. So this 1700s movement up to Vermont is not impossible. It's just tracking those people that becomes an interest. And we'll see here that as we go down in the children, we've got Eunice Ray born in Wrentham and dying in Wrentham, and Sarah Ray born in Wrentham, and then the last one here, 1783, dies in Norfolk. They're born in Norfolk, Massachusetts, which is the county, and then dies in Vermont. So we have another Vermont outlier here that starts to make you think that, yes, some of this family probably did move north to Vermont. But the question here that arises instantly is, why would this lady, in her old age, after all of her children are born and all of her children are still either in Massachusetts or in Vermont, why would she pick up and move to Georgia? That even makes it sound a little bit more unlikely. If she would leave all of her children and her, even where her husband was, assuming the second husband is in reality to Sarah Bragg, who also is married from Wrentham, Massachusetts, or Norfolk, Massachusetts. Why would they move to Georgia? That's a question that has to be answered in order to determine whether or not this lady, that information there is correct. Of course, we need to look at the sources. The interesting thing is, as I go through the sources, you would think, well, I looked at the sources, and the answer is, well, yeah, and we're going to look at them again, and we're probably going to look at them about every single time that we either come back to the family or try to find additional information about the family, because reviewing the sources and making sure that we're looking at and extracting all the information that we can possibly extract from the sources is extremely important. So we look down here for the marriages. There's that Benjamin Hall marriage. I can just click this detail view, and all of these will pop up expanded, so I don't have to do that individually. This is a Massachusetts marriage. We look at that one. This one is the same one, the same Wrentham, North Massachusetts book. So if we click that and look at that, this is Norfolk. And this was not the same book, but it shows that Benjamin Ray and Sarah Bragg were married April 17, 1759. And that this is the actual record, probably from the time period. Beautiful handwriting, by the way. So what we have basically determined at this point is that we have a whole list of mysteries. Number one is Sarah Bragg, the daughter of Abraham Bragg. Number two did Sarah Bragg die in Georgia? Number 3, did she remarry, and is there a second husband who it does not show in the FamilySearch family tree? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. We haven't looked for that yet. And the third question is why would she have left all of her children who lived in either Massachusetts or had moved up to Vermont and moved down to Georgia where she died? What was it possible, could have possibly happened that would have made this lady in the early 1800s travel clear down to Georgia and leave her family? So we have quite a few issues with this particular one, and we find also that there's some indexing mistakes. They have it Benjamin Hall listed as Benjamin instead of Benjamin Ray, and failure to pick up the second marriage. That's kind of the summary, and unfortunately it's getting a little bit complicated. The rest of these records, if you look at it, it says Sarah entry for William Ray, and it's the town clerk record. When it's listed that way, that means that the primary record is for William Ray, and Sarah is incidentally mentioned on the record. So when we look at that record, we see that it lists Sarah and her husband Benjamin Ray with a child named William Ray, born in January 1760 in Wrentham, Norfolk, Massachusetts. So if we go back to Sarah Ray's, we should find in the details, we should find that there is a William Ray born in 1760, and there is right there, first number one child here, and that particular record then ties Benjamin Ray and Sarah Bragg to someone named William Ray, who is a child, and gives us a date. So that's what we should be able to find is a list of people with records like that, being that this is New England, and these records were obviously being kept at that period of time. So we can expect that we'd find Cynthia and Gilbert and Susanna and Lester and whoever this Violet and Margaret and all of these people listed. If they were children, we should find those records for each of them. So if you have a suspect one, like here, that has 5 sources, and it says that she died and doesn't have a birth record, then we have to be looking to see whether or not this particular person was, how she got listed as a child of Benjamin and Sarah Bragg. So we look at her sources, and we see we have a federal census, find a grave, and Violet Ray and a Massachusetts birth and christenings, and in that shows that she was a female, Benjamin and Sarah in Wrentham in 1772. Answer is 21 June 1772, and the question we have now is well, that says there's a christening and there's a birth rate. Well, somebody has an interesting, didn't understand what they were looking at here, because this is not, well, it says it's a christening date in Wrentham. Okay, so there is christening date, and that indicates that she was born sometime before that. So we're pretty much on track. Should have, that is correctly recorded then, and she could have been born in 1771 or some other period earlier in 1772, so that doesn't rule out that she's a problem. So we're, we're not even, we don't have a problem here. Well, let's go back to Sarah Bragg. That one doesn't seem to be a problem. Maybe Margaret's the problem with 1772, but that's in October. And this one is a birth record and a christening record. Well, they have it on the same date. So let's see whether we have a birth record here. We have one, Margaret, and it's an extracted record, Margaret, 24 October, and it's a christening date also. Important to understand here that christening dates are not birth dates, period. That is something that is often confused. A christening date is the date that the child was baptized into whatever church, in this case, whatever church they belong to, which is not specified here in this particular record. We may be able to determine that by doing some research and figure out if they were which of the various sects that were available back then. More likely, if they were old-time Massachusetts families, they were probably Congregationalists. If they weren't Congregationalists, then they could have been, in that period of time, unless in Massachusetts, it would have been unusual. You would have to be very careful to figure out which church they did belong to. So we have two children christened in the same year. That's not unusual. I've had entire families, children christened all in the same year. So it doesn't show that there's any kind of conflict yet with determining who these people are. So now we're back to Sarah Bragg, and we're still looking at the children. And we have Eunice, and she is Wrentham. And we have Sarah, and she's in Wrentham. And we have a 1780. Now this is interesting because here's what's probably happened. And let's have a look at Sarah Ray. And yes, we do have a christening date in 1780. And then someone has put in a birth date of 1780. This is, you would say that this was a somewhat safe assumption, but now that we've seen that there may be some time differences in when the children were christened, that they may not have run down to the minister or priest as quickly as possible to have every child christened, that this child may not have been born in 1780, and the problem of assuming that they were born in 1780 when there was a christening in 1780 sometimes creates an issue in identifying the right person when you're doing research online or research otherwise. So when you start thinking, oh, this person was born in 1780, and then all of a sudden you are finding that it was actually a christening date, that can change when you begin to look for this person. And also age-wise, it is not impossible, and it does happen on occasion, that someone is christened much later in life, that they're not christened within a week or two of birth, but are christened when they get married or in other times in their life. So if we go back now to Sarah Bragg, we'll see where we are. We have one more person, Nancy, who's born in Norfolk and has a birth date in Norfolk. Good question here. Is this another birth record, or is this another instance where we have the christening record the same date as the birth record? In this case, we have apparently 13 sources. And one of those is Massachusetts Births and Christenings, and it's an IGI record, and it is a christening date of 8/17/83, 8 June of 1783. And so that is probably not correct. The birth date is not the same as the christening date, and unless there's another record that shows that she was actually born the day that she was christened. Not impossible, but not likely. No, there are no more Massachusetts birth records. Here's a town record, and we can check that town record. And that's on Ancestry. And this has her birth date as 8 June 1783. So, yep, folks, we've got one of those situations where apparently they may have had a difficult birth. They may have worried about the child living and rushed to get the minister there to have the christening done before the baby passed away. And she didn't pass away, so that was great. And so we have a recorded birth date. It's the same as the christening date, which doesn't bother me all that much. And I would think that that would be possible. Very small towns, by the way, folks. We're talking about little towns here, and the fact that somebody had a baby was pretty well known. One problem here we'll see with this christening date is that it's not a standardized date. So, incidentally, as we're kind of moving around and doing this kind of thing, we should probably clean that up and put some spaces in here so it looks like it's a real place. Was Norfolk in 1783 part of the United States? And the answer is, of course, it was. 1782, 1776, and all that. So we can add in Rentham, Norfolk, United States, and save that. And we have it standardized date now for that person. Well, we've done some examination here. We've made some raised some serious questions about this particular entry in the FamilySearch family tree as far as Sarah Bragg is concerned. We've also determined that all of these children are have been born in consistent places. The only problem we had was two listed in 1772, and one of those is clearly a christening record, and the other is both a christening and birth record. They all have a consistent names for the parents. The places are all consistent. We have no reason to believe that these children are not correct. If I were doing further research on any of the children's lines, then I would continue to try to find additional information and make sure we had their families complete. But in this particular case, we're still now focusing on Sarah Bragg, and we're coming to the conclusion that some of the information that we have, perhaps this fact that this place did not exist in 1813, Johnson County, and that Span doesn't really show up as a place in Johnson County that yet, and maybe, and the fact that there may be another marriage out there leads us to believe that we have some research to be done. This, by the way, 1737 in the United States is probably wrong. This one also is not correctly standardized, so we're going to have to standardize that. How you do that is click right after the entry, click the put your cursor right after the entry and click, and touch the space bar. That brings up the correct standardized form. And in this one, correct standardized form is not going to include USA or United States, so we're going to take that off. And we could use British colonial America. That's one possibility, 1691 to 1776, and that seems to be the time period that we want to use, so we click that and save. Of course, there is some discussion out there about the appropriateness of British colonial America, but that's another discussion, not particularly pertinent here. Well, that kind of wraps up our examination of Sarah Bragg today. Uh, I've got some other things that I'd like to do in these videos. I'll come back to this, and we'll look at the Sarah Bragg again, and maybe we'll clean up a death date. But right now we have definite problems in accepting that she is the daughter of Alexander Bragg. And if she is, then we have some corrections here that may need to be made as to where she died, and by adding in a second husband. So thanks for watching another Exploring Genealogy Series recording and video. I'd like to invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's under my name. It's under James Tanner. And you'll find that there's half a dozen or so James Tanners down there that have done other videos. And if you look for James Tanner channel, then you will find James Tanner and my picture. So you're going to have to kind of remember what I look like from my picture, and that will get you back to my channel. So this is this ends Another Theories, and thanks for watching.